We're in a series called Influencers, and we're just talking about 5 Old Testament characters that are somewhat obscure, somewhat unknown to us, and yet through their life and through their example, they made an impact for God's story, for God's kingdom. And certainly, the Old Testament character that we're talking about today did in an incredible way as well. We live, before I reveal who it is, we live in an instant world, don't we? We want everything, and we want it about 20 seconds ago, right? We have everything that we just want instant. We pull up. I don't know about you guys. Are you guys like me in this sick way where you like, if your internet doesn't load in about 3 seconds or less, you're like, what's wrong? What's going on with this? Reload, right? Because we want everything. We want information. We want it right now, right? Gone are the days where we had to look stuff up in a book or deal with the remember those days where you had to like wait for the internet to actually connect and then nobody could talk on the phone? Some of you don't know what I'm talking about. Some of you do, right? We have GPS where we can find out where we need to go instantly, and then all the Yelp reviews about the place we want to go, right? And we have it all instantly. Gone are the days where you have to look up things in maps anymore, right? We have instant food. We have our instant oats because oatmeal was taking way too long to cook, so we needed it now, right? We needed to be able to microwave it in a minute, because I don't want to have to wait longer than a minute for oatmeal, right? We just live in this Insta world, right? If we don't have information in our fingertips, like even last night, I found myself, I knew I was going to preach this message, and last night I found myself like, why hasn't it updated yet? Why hasn't it updated yet? Why hasn't the standings updated yet? It was a sports thing. Why hasn't the standings updated yet? Why is it? And then I didn't want it to update because my beloved Mariners are now out of the playoffs. Oh, all right. I'll live. I'll survive. I appreciate those of you who have checked on my well-being this morning. I do appreciate that. We like everything to happen on our timetable. And often, this is where the rub happens. We want God to act on our timetable. And when he doesn't, we get mad, we get upset, we get offended at God. Today we're going to talk about when God doesn't move the way we thought he would. When God doesn't move the way we thought. See, some people think God is like some cosmic vending machine where we should be able to go up, insert a couple prayers, pull the lever, and whatever we ask for comes out. And I think for most of us, we've been around a little bit long enough to know that that's not really how prayer works. That's not how God works. But yet, in times of waiting, in times of prayer, and in times when we really want something to happen, we can still kind of fall into that mode where we're like, God, I want it, and I want it now. I want the answer now. I want it, and I want you to answer the way that I want you to answer. But when we need to realize with prayer, with our requests to God, and with how God relates to us, God answers often in one of 3 ways. Sometimes he says yes. When we pray or we ask God, we petition God for something off, sometimes he will say yes. Sometimes he says no. And then what I've found is even harder is sometimes he says, not yet. Wait. And it's in that waiting season that sometimes is the very hardest. And today, we're going to look at a humble influencer whose life was all about waiting. Her name was Hannah. Again, very convinced that this is the hello, my name is name tags that they would have worn in the Old Testament. Hannah is an amazing woman, and we find her story again in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 2. Her name means gracious. And Hannah was one of the first women in the Bible that we see praying and having a spiritual encounter with God. We're going to read about her story today. Hannah, though, had one of the hardest heartaches that a woman can possibly have, especially in the first century. She was barren. She couldn't have children. There's not many greater heartaches for many women than to have the heart to be a mother, have the desire to nurture and love on and cherish a mother as a mother, but not be able to have children. I know that some of you maybe have walked through that or are walking through that. And that's where Hannah was. Hannah desired to have children, wanted children, but was unable to. And what was worse about her situation was her husband, Elkanah, was a Levite who belonged to one of the most honorable families in the priestly tribe. And yet Elkanah was this undistinguished priest because he followed the common custom of the land, not of what God said, but he followed the common custom of polygamy. And his other wife, Peninnah could have children, but Hannah could not. And so that added to the heartache. We read it, and we'll just pick up the story starting in 1 Samuel. Now this man used to go up year by year, this was Elkanah, to his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he would give a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore, Hannah wept and would not eat. So what's even worse, Hannah's heartbroken. She wants children. She wants a son, and God had not allowed her to have a son. It says right here that God had closed her womb. And she was calling out to the Lord and wanted a son. What was even worse was that Elkanah's other wife was kind of being a jerk, right? Like was just poking fun at her because she couldn't have children. The heartbreak and the waiting there was too much to bear. But Hannah's story teaches us something really interesting. And it's this, that humble influencers teach us that the change we long for may not be immediate. And that's hard in Hannah's story, and that's hard in our stories, right? Because there's likely many of you who are in a waiting season. And if you're not in a waiting season right now, you will be. Because so often comes when we pray and we're asking God for things like Hannah was asking for a child, and when we ask God for things, sometimes the answer comes yes, sometimes the answer comes no, but what's even harder is the waiting. And when you're in a waiting season, what do we do? Hannah was in a situation where she had to wait on the Lord. We're going to read the rest, a bit more of her story, and then we'll make some application and draw some conclusions about what it looks like to wait and what we do in those seasons of waiting, what Hannah did in those seasons that may encourage our hearts in seasons of waiting. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. And she continued praying before the Lord. Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have not drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early. That's a weird encounter. Let's just pause right there. Like, we just recognize that was a weird encounter. He went from stop being drunk to, oh, all right, well, the Lord grants whatever you're asking. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, and they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. We'll pause right there, and we'll pick it up in just a minute. So what can we learn from this strange encounter, this Hannah, year after year? This was a season of waiting, right? This wasn't like, oh, she wanted a son, and then a week later they went up to worship, and then she had a son. No, this indicates this was year after year after year that she would go up and she would petition the Lord for a child. She was in a season of waiting. And just because I don't want to forget this week, the clock represents waiting. Last week, I'll just give you a little insight. Last week, I left a pitcher and a towel, which was supposed to indicate serving, and I got called out because I'm like, you had this up here, and you didn't say a single word about it. So last week, Aaron, he was a servant, just like many servers would have a pitcher to refill and a towel to wait on. This represents waiting. Have I covered it, ladies? All right. So we'll put that right there, and they'll be happy. So what lessons do we learn about waiting on the Lord from Hannah's story? If you have your notes, you can write in the first thing in. Waiting is active, not passive. We see this in Hannah's story. While she was at the temple on their yearly trip, this happens while they go up to the Lord. And first thing I want to notice is how broken this family dynamic is within this house, right? Hannah is, from what we know about her story, she's a godly woman. And essentially, though, what her husband Elkanah says to Hannah is, hey, listen, I know I'm married to two of you, but I love you most. That's messed up, right? Like, let's just throw that out. That's pretty screwed up, right? And this is, so we know that Elkanah loves Hannah because he keeps giving her extra portions. And this angers Peninnah, who has children, who thinks, hey, I have been able to give my husband children and sons, so he should love me more, but Elkanah doesn't love her more. He loves Hannah more. This gets weird, right? This creates problems. And so Peninnah, she begins to make fun of and mock Hannah. She's like, I can have children and you can't, na, right? I'm sure that's exactly what she said it too. And what Peninnah was declaring was that the only way that you can build your identity, Hannah, is through children. The only way that you have any worth to anybody is because you can have kids. What Elkanah was telling her was, that shouldn't matter because you should build your identity on the fact that you're my wife and that I love you most. You should build your identity on the fact that I care for you and I give you extra. Right? And so before Hannah, there are these two idolatrous thoughts, right? That your identity comes through only your children, or your identity only comes through the person that you marry or the person that loves you. And what Hannah does is reject all of that, and she comes to God. I love what verse 9 says. It says she stood up. In the Hebrew language, to stand up means to take action. And this is what Hannah does. She is receiving this mocking from the other wife. She's receiving from her husband, hey, you shouldn't be sad because my love is all that you should need in your life. I should be the only thing you need in your life. And she, after dinner, stands up and says, I need to go to God because He's what I need. I need to go up to meet with the Lord. I need to go lay my requests again before the Lord, again before the Lord. This happens yearly, and this is what we're talking about, that waiting is an active thing and not a passive thing, because a lot of times when we are in seasons of waiting, one of two things happens. We say, well, I asked God for it, and now I'm just going to sit here and not do anything, right? I asked him once, that should be enough. I went up to the cosmic vending machine, I entered my prayer in, I pulled the lever, and now God should spit out the answer. That's one extreme. Or the other extreme is, yes, I prayed to God, but I'm not going to trust Him with it. I'm going to go create up backup plans out of my own strength, in case God doesn't come through for me. And both of those things Hannah rejects because she continually comes before the Lord and pleads with God. And he makes a vow before the Lord. She stood up and went to God. What Hannah recognized is that what was being offered to her was two false choice things, and she needed to go to God. And that's what we need to do in seasons of waiting, is to continue to come before the Lord, to continue to come and ask Him, to be active in our pursuit of Him in seasons of waiting. To not get mad or offended that God isn't answering in our timetable, but that we continue to come before God. I think of waiting on the Lord, and this is just kind of the thing that's stood out to me or given me a word picture for this. You know when you're at a restaurant, the person that comes and serves you is called a what? A waiter, right? And we know that good waiters, right? They don't just come once, fill your glasses bring your water, bring your food, and then go sit down and do nothing for the rest of the night, right? And then if you run out of things, they're like, well, too bad, right? That wouldn't get a very good tip from us. We would get pretty upset about that, right? A good waiter is active. He keeps coming back. He keeps checking in. He's present. When we are talking to God about things, we need to be present, active, continually coming before him. He encourages us. If you read throughout all of Scripture about what it looks like to pray, it is a picture of continually bringing ourselves to the Lord. And Jesus even celebrates that in some of the stories that he talks about. When we're in seasons of waiting, that means that we're active and not passive, just like Hannah. Second thing we can do when we're in a season of waiting is ask this question. Ask, what is God trying to teach or develop in me in this season of waiting? What is God trying to teach or develop in me? Although seasons of waiting are hard, often confusing, God is wanting to teach us something in those seasons. Teach us something about himself or teach us something about ourselves. And if we stay plugged into that, if we stay connected to God, if we're active and not passive, then God will be faithful even in the seasons of waiting to reveal to us what he's trying to teach or develop in us, the lessons that he's trying to help us understand. We have been reading about that a little bit this week in our discipleship groups. We started off the New Testament, and it started off by talking about the 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Between when Malachi leaves off and where Matthew starts, we have one page that says the New Testament on it. That one page equals 400 years where God was somewhat silent. At least he wasn't speaking through prophets or the way that he had been before. The whole nation was in a season of waiting. And God was trying to teach and develop something in the nation during that time, getting them ready for what the ultimate answer to their heart's cry would be in Jesus. Sometimes in waiting, friends, God is trying to teach us and show us and prepare us for his ultimate answer in Jesus. The third thing, you can write this in, that often God is waiting for us to surrender. This is the hard part. Sometimes the waiting that we are in is dependent on our willingness to surrender. Hannah prays to God, and it's a short prayer. Her long prayer of celebration comes in chapter 2, and you should read that this week. It's a beautiful prayer of celebration, but her prayer at the temple was a fairly short prayer. And the first part of the prayer is all about God. I love how she starts out, "O Lord of hosts," recognizing the power and the might of God. She paints a picture and declares who God is, and then she pours out herself in the reality of who God is and what God has to offer. She brings her heart and lays it bare before God. And I think that sometimes we go one of two ways with this, right? Sometimes we have these raw emotions in season of waiting, but we don't take them to God, we take them to everybody else. And we lay them out before everybody else as if they can do anything about it, right? But it feels good to just lay it all out before to get everybody else on our side or get everybody else to feel bad for us. So on one hand, we take it to everybody, but not to the one who can actually do something about it. Or we just kind of clam up and keep it to ourselves, and we don't let anybody else see our emotions. We don't let anybody else see our needs or our desires, and so we just hold it all in. And what Hannah does in humility as she brings it and pours out her heart. All of Hannah's life, she wanted a child for herself. And humanly speaking, that was right. Especially in the BC where she was living, in those days when she was living in ancient societies, family, economic, and status and stature were directly tied to how many children you had. The more children you had, the bigger labor force there was, so you were more blessed. The more labor you had, the more production you had, the more money you had, right? And beyond that, in the home, Hannah was concerned about who was going to take care of her when she was older. That was another primary reason why it was women needed to have children, so that they were taken care of. There was no retirement homes back then, right? There was no assisted living communities back then, right? It was somebody's health was and well-being was directly was responsible to their children. So humanly speaking, she was right. She wanted a child so that it would take care of her, that would bless her life, so that she would stop getting made fun of, so that the people in the town would think higher of her, and so that she could be taken care of physically. None of those things are wrong, but they're incomplete. And here's what Hannah does, though. She comes and she finally surrenders all of that and says, God, I don't want a child for me. I want a child for you. Give me a son so that he can serve you, so that he can be devoted to you. She finally laid it down and said, God, I don't want it for me anymore. That's what I've wanted my whole life, is a child for me. But now I'm making you a vow that if you give me a child, he will be for you. He will be dedicated to you and for you to serve in your temple all the days of his life. What a moment of surrender. Can you imagine for her? Laying down the dreams that she had her whole life. In our seasons of waiting, sometimes it's going to look like laying down some of the things that we thought we had figured out. Or laying down some of our dreams and saying, God, I've always wanted this for me. But if you see different, if you need something different, okay. We've talked about this a lot over the last several months here, but I've really come to believe that this right here, this has to be the posture that we get ourselves in to be followers of Jesus. Hands open, saying, God, I have a lot that I want, but here it is. You can have it. My dreams, my hopes, my resources, my time, my energy, my heartache, here. It's yours. Do with it what you want. And I'm not going to say that when you finally do that, everything in your life is going to come about like it did for Hannah, right? That's not an A plus B equals C equation, because that's not how God works in equations. But what I am saying is this: when we get ourselves into a posture where we can lay it down. God will do something. God is faithful to do something in that space. And sometimes it's not what we expected, it's not what we prayed for, it's not what we hoped for. But it's what his plan was all along. And in that, we can appreciate and walk in that space. And the last thing we learn about surrender is this, or waiting is this: when God answers our prayers, honor him. When God answers our prayers, honor him. Hannah took her grief and her burden to God. She didn't stop asking God until she heard from him. And in her request, she promised to give her son back to God, committed that her son would be a Nazirite. In other words, no razor would touch his head. There was a Nazirite vow along with a bunch of other things that were involved with a Nazirite vow. But basically, it was that he would be set apart, completely separate and holy unto God, and that his life would be dedicated to serving God. God answered and granted her request. We read just a few moments ago that when they got home, she found out she was pregnant. And then this is the rest of the chapter. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice. So fast forward a year from when Hannah had prayed this prayer last. Fast forward a year, and they were going up again. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, "As soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever." Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word." So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her along with a 3-year-old bull and an ephah of flour and a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli and said, "Oh, my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. The next time that the families went to offer sacrifices, Hannah stays home. She wanted to wean her baby before she took him up and offered his life to be dedicated to the Lord. And then they went up and they offered sacrifices, and they took Samuel to Eli. I just want you to think for a moment how hard this must have been for Hannah, right? This baby that she had longed for, that she had somewhat surrendered for, but then in this moment, it must have been so real for her. I mean, let's just take this off the pages of the Bible for a moment and put yourself there, right? She knew what she needed to do, but how hard and gut-wrenching that must have been in the moment. Going from this child, he's 3 years old at this point, 3 or 4 years old. And she brings him and says, "I guess I'll only see you once a year." But she had made a vow to the Lord to honor this boy's life in the service of God, and she kept it. Friends, when God answers our prayers, when God comes through, honor him. Honor him. There's been so many people throughout history who have vowed things to God, who have said, God, if you come through this one time, then I will fill in the blank. Maybe you're one of them who have made those declarations to God, and then God came through for you, or God came through for them, and they're like, oh, never mind. I didn't really mean that. Oh, thanks God for answering that prayer. Now I'm going to rescind on what I've promised to you. Friends, in our petitions to God, don't vow things that you're not willing to keep. What an amazing story from this woman who went from waiting year after year after year. And then God honors her prayers. She has a son, and then she keeps her vow to the Lord, honors him with what she said. And it just teaches us, and we said this earlier, it just teaches us all again, though, that humble influencers teach us that change we long for may not be immediate, right? Hannah was a picture of humble waiting. And here's the beautiful thing about Hannah's story. It's that boy Samuel that she brought to the temple to serve in God's temple. Her son was the last judge of Israel. He anointed Israel's first two kings. He became a prophet, the first prophet. He led the greatest Passovers that were ever given in Israel's history. He served God his whole life, and he was known as one of the greatest men in the Old Testament. Hannah slips from this moment on, slips out of view, right? The New Testament doesn't talk about Hannah. We don't know much more about her after this. After chapter 2, she prays this amazing prayer, and then she slips into somewhat of the background. But her life and her influence continue to flow through the pages of the New Testament because of her son, Samuel. Sometimes the things we are waiting for, they don't come about directly through us, but indirectly through us. And for some of us, that is the surrender piece. But I wanted that. What are you waiting for today? Because the change that you long for may not be immediate. And in the instant world that we live in, we have to recognize God doesn't work on our timetable. Nor, if we look back over the history of our lives, do we want him to. Oh, like Hannah, can we come and bring our requests before the Lord, continually coming and bringing our requests from the Lord, denying the false choice of what the world has to offer and continue to be active in our coming before the Lord? Can we learn the lessons that God is trying to teach us, or the things he's trying to develop us in the waiting season? Can we come with a posture of surrender and saying, God, it may not look how I thought it was going to look, but here it is. And however God answers, can we honor him? That he is God and that he knows best. You should go home today, right after here, and read 1 Samuel chapter 2. We don't have time to read it, but it is a beautiful prayer of Hannah pouring out her heart and honoring God for what has come. What's beautiful is Hannah would go on to have 3 sons and 2 daughters. And so God continued to just pour out into her because she honored him What are you waiting for? Will you honor him in that time?